Okay guys, this is the practical number 3 vertebral column. It looks really intimidating, but as you go through these, you'll see there's kind of repeats. It's just different types of vertebra. So let's get started with the cervical vertebra. You'll notice there's a 7 here, and that means there's 7 cervical vertebrae. C1 and C2, atlas and axis, these are the first two. C1 right here is very unique in that it has these two flat facets. These are the superior articular facets of the atlas. This is where the occipital condyles of the skull are actually going to sit. This is the axis, okay? You'll notice I have them all kind of pointing the same way. This is the spinous process, which we'll get to. This is the anterior, this is the posterior. And you'll notice this is very unique as well. The atlas sits on top of the axis so that your head can rotate. And you'll notice, we'll talk about this little structure right here. If you fracture this, you are pretty much paralyzed from the neck down. This is what the C3 through C7 vertebrae look like, cervical. What makes a cervical vertebra is these transverse foramen. These allow for the passage of the cranial nerves. The other vertebrae do not have these foramen, these transverse foramen. So that is the characteristic of a cervical vertebra, those transverse foramen, okay, these little holes. Okay, so let's start with the atlas. I'll bring this over here. So we have the superior articulating facets right here, which is what your skull will sit on. Then you have the transverse process. Transverse obviously is going to mean on the sides or horizontal. So this is one of them, this is the other one. So if I'm holding this, I'm holding on to both transverse processes of the atlas. Transverse foramen, those are the little holes that I was telling you about that characterize a cervical vertebra from the others. Okay. Vertebral foramen, this is where the spinal cord will pass through. If I turn it upside down, I have to see I will see the inferior articulating facets. These are going to articulate with the vertebra below. So in this case, if this is C1 or the atlas, this is going to articulate with the superior articulating facets of the axis, okay? Speaking of the axis, this guy is the axis. We have the superior articulating facets. We have the body, which is kind of this whole area that I'm holding on to. That's the body. Transverse processes are very small on the axis. One's here and one is here. Transverse foramen, little holes, one here and one on the other side. Okay. Vertebral foramen, you get the idea. Like I said, this repeats. That's where the spinal cord will go. Underneath are going to be the articulating facets. So these two flat facets or flat articular surfaces, they're going to articulate with C3, the next cervical vertebra. The dens is this piece right here sticking up. Okay. And that's the atlas and the axis. So now a typical cervical vertebra, 3 through 7, would look like this. You'll notice it still has those transverse foramen. Okay. So the cervical vertebrae, we're going to talk about the big spinous process here. This is going to go along the posterior and it's going to angle down, because if it angled up, we would have a lot of things sticking out of our back. So it angles down. That's the spinous process of a cervical vertebra. This is the superior articulating facets. Transverse processes. One here, one here. Transverse foramen. One here, one here. Vertebral foramen. The pen is going through it. And of course, if I look on the underside, these two flat surfaces here are the inferior articulating facets that are going to articulate with the vertebra underneath it. Okay, so those are cervical. Any one, if you just get the card cervical vertebra, you could pick any one of these three. These are the two unique C1 atlas, C2 axis, And this is one that would be indicative of what a C3 through C7 would look like. Now we have a thoracic vertebra. The characteristic of a thoracic vertebra is not this spinous process, which they do typically appear to be thin and spiny. However, what makes these unique and the characteristic of them are these little facets. Okay, this is the facet for the articulation of a rib on that side, and you can see this little dent in here. That is the facet for the articulation of a rib. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 1 through 12, and we have 12 ribs. Okay, so that makes sense. So here's the spinous process of a thoracic vertebra. Here are the superior articulating facets. You can see they're kind of in a different spot, but they are flat. It's kind of hard to see with this camera. Okay. The transverse processes are very, very much wing-like, okay, because again, we have to have these facets for the articulation of the rib. Okay, so and here's the vertebral foramen. It may not be on the list, but you should know that that's where the spinal cord passes through. Okay, so that is the thoracic vertebra. Then finally, we have the big five. Obviously, this thick body helps to absorb the shock of, just the weight of our bodies on our spine. So we have 5 of these. This is that big spinous process. You'll notice again, it's not facing up, it is facing down, so you know how to orient these things to look at them. So this is a spinous process. These 2 big wings are the transverse processes, and you'll notice they don't have any facets on them because no ribs articulate there. They also do not have any transverse foramen because no cervical or cranial nerves go through them. The body is this big guy right here. This whole thing is the body of a lumbar vertebra. And we have the superior articulating facets right here. Of course, we have the vertebral foramen. It isn't on your list, but again, you should know that that is where the spinal cord passes through. If it was on the list, and it's not, but it should be, the inferior articulating facets are down here. Not quite as flat as normal as the other ones that you've seen, but they are a little bit flat, and this allows for the articulation to the lumbar vertebra below. Or, if this is L5, it will articulate with the sacrum. This is the sacrum. As you can see, it's fused vertebrae, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes they say there's 5. It depends on the book. But there are sacral foramina, little holes. This is the median sacral crest. As I look at it, it sticks up and it's in the middle, so median sacral crest. And then again, these are the superior articular facets of the sacrum. This would articulate with the inferior articular facets of L5. I kind of put it right there. Okay. It's not shown here, but at the inferior end of the sacrum, there should be a little bone here, and sometimes they're loose in the box back here, but all you need to do is show me where it would be, or if there's a skeleton when you're taking a practical, just show me on the skeleton. That's your tailbone, the coccyx. Okay, it's not on here, but it should be, and it'll be on the skeleton that's with me during the practicals. Okay, and that's it. That's the practical number 3, the vertebral column.